Good afternoon. First, I would like to thank Elena profusely for inviting me to participate in this colloquium. And second, I want to express how delighted I am to be among scholars whose work I've long admired, including Ramon Gutierrez and also Verena Stolke. And as some of you know, Verena Stolke was one of the pioneer thinkers of the intersections of race, class, and gender in colonial Latin America, and her work really has inspired many scholars, including myself. Also, before I start actually going through my presentation, I wanted to come back to this question that someone had asked before, because I think it's very important, about the different mechanisms that slaves in colonial Mexico had to achieve freedom. There were various mechanisms, but a very important one to achieve freedom, not for themselves, but for their children, was through reproducing with women who were free. Very early on in the 16th century, the Spanish crown decided to honor the canon law principle of the free womb, the ley del principio del vientre libre, so that if a slave reproduced with, say, a native woman, a Spanish woman was kind of out of the question at this point in the 16th century, but if he reproduced with a native woman, his children were free, and they were called mulattos. So the first mulattos that arise in New Spain are actually, most of them, the children of blacks and native women, and this drove colonial authorities absolutely crazy, and they asked the Crown to revoke the principle of the free womb, but the Crown did not, in part because it wanted to honor the principle of the free womb, but also because, as some scholars have argued, it was seeking to create a free wage labor force. This occurs at a time when there is when the demographic collapse of the native population is beginning, and there are a lot of shortages of labor. So I just wanted to clarify, because I don't get to talk too much about that in my paper. During the past 3 decades, by the way, the title of my talk is The Language, Genealogy, and Classification of Race in Colonial Mexico. During the past 3 decades, studies of race have tended to stress that the meanings and uses of the concept have varied across time, spaces, and cultures. Indeed, the notion seems to derive some of its power from its very epistemological and historical instability, from what Thomas C. Holt calls its chameleon-like and parasitic nature. Chameleon-like because of its ability to transmute, parasitic because of its tendency to attach itself to other social phenomena. Despite Holt's emphasis on the cultural and historical specificity of racial ideologies, he, as well as other scholars, anchors modern notions of race in the 16th century. During this period, the term race began to appear with some frequency in the Romance languages, as well as in English, and European expansion to the Americas, the establishment of the transatlantic slave trade, and other global processes started to forge the Atlantic world, that metaphorical and physical space of cultural interactions and hybridity. But if the emergence of modern notions of race and the rise of the Atlantic world went hand in hand, the racial ideologies that surfaced in that world also differed in significant ways due to the particularities of European colonizing projects and the ways in which they confronted local conditions, peoples, and change in the Americas. In parts of Spanish America, for example, these particularities produced a system of classification based on African, European, and Native American descent, the sistema de castas, some of the underlying principles of which were depicted in the 18th century Mexican pictorial genre, now known as the casta paintings. Because the rise, development, and significance of this genre have been discussed by a number of scholars, most recently and notably by Elena Martinez-Lopez, there's no need to elaborate on the paintings here. The focus of this discussion, rather, is on 3 sets of questions that they raise about the nature and history of classification in New Spain, and more generally about colonial Mexico's racial ideology. First, why is the language of social differentiation mainly one of casta, caste, and not raza, race? What did these Castilian terms mean in the early modern period, and how was their deployment linked to Spanish cultural and religious principles and notions of social order? Second, when and why did casta classifications emerge, and in what institutional and social contexts were they used? Finally, what implication did Hispanic definitions of race and caste have on Central Mexican notions of mestizaje? which, as Verena noted, there is no translation, no perfect translation for. Addressing these three sets of questions will allow me to provide a very brief overview of what of Mexican colonial racial ideology and help to explain why it took the form that it did. And I should stress that I don't propose to be exhaustive and that many of the nuances and complexities of this ideology, which spans at least 300 years, will have to be sacrificed for the sake of brevity. Race and caste. Although the exact origins of the Castilian word raza are uncertain, perhaps dating back as far as the 13th century, its use started to become prominent in the 1500s. As was the case with its equivalents in other European languages, it generally referred to lineage, as Theo Goldberg was saying earlier. As such, the word was sometimes used to distinguish between nobles and commoners, between landed elites and serfs. In the course of the 16th century, however, the Spanish concept of race took a different direction as it attached itself like a parasite to religion and came to refer not so much to ancestry from pecheros, taxpayers, or villanos, commoners, but to descent from Jews, Muslims, and eventually other religious categories. This shift went hand in hand with the establishment of the infamous Limpieza de Sangre statutes, requirements of pure and old Christian ancestry that various Spanish religious and secular institutions began to adopt in the second half of the 15th century, and which were deployed first against Jewish converts to Christianity, the conversos, and then against Muslim ones as well, the moriscos. As these institutions developed legal procedures to distinguish old from new Christians, the Castilian term raza, whose meanings had previously varied, was displaced onto those who were considered impure and defined in unequivocally negative terms. For this reason, old Christians seldom applied it to themselves. Jews, Muslims, and even Protestants were marked through the concept of race, but not the people with putatively long and unsullied ties to Christianity. And temporality is absolutely crucial for understanding the concept of purity of blood. With the generations, you can become an old Christian. And this is going to be a central concept that the native population in central Mexico is going to hold on to, especially as of the late 17th century. The spread of the Spanish statutes of purity of blood, combined with the lingering importance of Castilian concepts of nobility, heightened the Spanish obsession with lineage. This obsession was manifested not only in the rise of linajudos, experts in genealogies who devoted themselves to policing lineages for signs of impure ancestry, but in the pervasiveness of a language of blood that in the 17th century became increasingly Baroque. Terms such as sangre, blood, casta, breeding, generación, lineage, raíz, root, tronco, trunk, rama, branch, figured prominently in Castile's social and legal vocabulary and continued to be important well into the following century. Even though in the 18th century, terms like calidad, clase, condición, which are more related to class, start to compete with these older terms. Although the occurrence and persistence of this terminology in the Iberian Peninsula was mainly propelled by internal dynamics, by the re-feudalization of Castilian society and spread of the Limpieza de Sangre statutes, it was also influenced by events in Spanish America, which during the 16th and 17th century also produced its own language of blood. This language, however, was not fundamentally one of raza, but of casta. How did this second term differ? Because both raza and casta could refer to breed, species, and lineage, they were at times used interchangeably to describe groupings of animals, plants, or humans. The latter term, however, had a series of other connotations. If it's a noun, it was usually linked to lineage. As an adjective, it could allude to chastity, nobility, good breeding, and legitimacy, and more generally to an uncorrupted sexual and genealogical history. Casta was thereby able to give way to the term castizo, which referred to a person of notable ancestry and legitimate birth. By implication, the mother of a castizo would have been casta, a woman who had remained faithful to her husband. So when applied to humans, the 16th century Spanish word casta and its various connotations were clearly alluding to a system of social order centered around procreation and biological parenthood, one in which reproducing the pure and noble caste, as Verena was saying earlier, was mainly predicated on maintaining the chastity of its women. So whether in the old or new world, notions of caste purity and their privileging of endogamic marriage and legitimate birth were never completely divorced because of women's role in reproduction from discourses of gender and female sexuality, from a sexual economy constituted by gender notions of familial honor. To make matters more complicated, however, Spaniards came up with new uses for the word casta in the Americas, to say nothing of the Portuguese in India. Some of its metropolitan connotations survived, but it quickly came to function in the plural as an umbrella term for the children of mixed unions. Castas were the new lineages produced by reproduction between the three main trunks of colonial society: Spaniards, Native Americans, and Africans. In Mexico, this deployment of the term began around the mid-16th century, shortly after a nomenclature distinguishing people of mixed ancestry or lineages began to surface, its first and most enduring terms being mestizo and mulatto. Hence, when later in the century, Diego de Simancas, the child of Spanish Indian parents, was tried by the Mexican Inquisition for allegedly believing that Jesus was not the true Son of God, he was asked to declare not his race, but his caste. Once the term casta was applied to people of mixed ancestry, it began to acquire negative connotations, but it remained distinct from and more neutral than the concept of raza, which, as stressed earlier, became closely tied to religion, and in particular to Jewish and Muslim descent. Hence, mestizos, mulattos, and in a general sense, also Spaniards and Indians, were considered castes, lineages, but not necessarily races. Or rather, not all of these categories had race. Anthropologist Laura Lewis is thus partly correct when she observes that early modern Spain elaborated an exclusionary discourse on race within its peninsular borders at the same time that it created a more inclusive system of caste lineages in the Americas, one that allowed for the different castes to claim to be connected genealogically through genealogical or symbolic kinship ties. However, such a rigid distinction between the two systems of differentiation cannot be drawn. Not only did castes in the colonies become increasingly racialized over time, increasingly essentializing, but contrary to what Lewis asserts, the concept of race was deployed in Spanish America before the period of the Enlightenment. As my work on limpieza de sangre-related documents from colonial Mexico demonstrates, notions of raza and impurity started to be used against persons of African ancestry as early as the start of the 17th century, in some cases even before. For example, in 1599, Cristobal Ruiz de Quiros submitted his genealogical information to the Franciscan order in Puebla in order to prove that he descended from, quote, a clean caste and generation without the race or mixture of Moors, mulattoes, blacks, Jews, and other newly converted sects. The Spanish deployment of notions of impurity and race against Africans and their descendants can be primarily attributed to their association with slavery, an institution that, we forget, in the 16th and 17th century was did not just simply have economic, but also religious significations. For early modern Spaniards and other Europeans, the condition of enslavement was not just one of debasement, and hence the antithesis of nobleza de sangre, of nobility, but a function of religious infidelity or ancestral sin. So, thus, when the transatlantic slave trade began in earnest and it became less and less feasible to contend that bondage was a tool to convert infidels, the enslavement of Africans as well as their darker skin color was increasingly explained in Portugal, Spain, and other European countries as a result of their being the cursed descendants of Ham. During the 17th century plantation revolution, the Hamitic myth was even more solidly linked to blackness and slavery, manifesting the rise, in Robin Blackburn's words, of a Christian European or white racial consciousness. In the Spanish Atlantic world, the institution of slavery not only resulted in the common association of people of African ancestry to the stained biblical genealogy of Ham, but undermined their ability to prove that their blood was pure. Because slaves had few lineage claims, they and their descendants were not able to certify through Castilian legal formulas that they were old Christians. In other words, they could not establish the temporal depth of their ancestors' loyalty to Christianity. And you see this over again in Probanzas de limpieza de sangre, the certificates of purity of blood. Why aren't mulattoes pure of blood? Because we cannot certify that they descend from old Christians, that they are old Christians. So, the extension of Spanish notions of impurity and race to black ancestry shaped the form of the Sistema de Castas, which, at least in New Spain, quickly marked the castas who had African ancestry apart from the rest. This marking is reflected in Mexico's casta nomenclature itself. For example, the term mestizo, which in Mexico surfaced in the 1530s, and by the next decade had become almost synonymous with illegitimacy, simply meant mixed and had been used in Spain mainly to refer to the mixture of different animal species. The category of mulatto which in the Spanish colonies only appeared on a regular basis as of 1549, referred to the children of Spaniards and blacks, and in general to anyone with partial African ancestry. According to the 17th century jurist Solórzano Pereira, the term mulatto was used to describe the offspring of Spaniards and blacks because they were considered an uglier, quote, and more unique mixture than mestizos, and because the word conveyed the idea that their nature was akin to that of mules. Mules, of course, were thought not to be able to reproduce themselves. So again, the emphasis is on reproduction. Since both mestizo and mulatto derive from a zoological vocabulary and implied crossbreeding, neither appellation was exactly flattering. However, as Solórzano Pereira suggested, their use marked an important difference in Spanish attitudes towards reproduction with blacks and indigenous people. This difference becomes even more evident in the next two casta categories that surface in central Mexico, castizo and morisco. The first, which emerged in the last third of the 16th century, referred to the child of a Spaniard and a mestizo, or someone who was only 1/4 Indian. The second was at first more ambiguous, for it was associated with blacks, Islam, or both, but by the early 17th century referred to a person that was 1 part black and 3/4 Spaniard. Needless to say, the two terms carried significantly different cultural baggage. In Spain, castizo alluded to a person of good lineage and caste, while morisco referred to Muslim converts to Christianity. It is true that when Mexican Inquisition officials first explained the meaning of castizo, they did not associate the category with any redeeming qualities. In a 1576 letter to the Supreme Council of the Inquisition, which was based in Spain, they wrote that the descendants, quote, the descendants of Indios mestizos, or castizos, as they're called here, in general are regarded as vile and despicable, restless and vicious, liars and unable to keep secrets. And they added that the white skin of some of them allowed them to deceive Spaniards regarding their true descent in order to enter religious orders. So it's interesting because the quote not only suggests that phenotype is already playing a very important role in colonial relations, but that exclusions based on ancestry were already operating in certain institutions. Nonetheless, despite this disparaging construction of castizos by the inquisitors in 1576, the displacement of a word that in Castile mainly had positive connotations unto the children of mestizos and Spaniards was no linguistic accident. It not only acknowledged the aristocratic bloodlines of some castizos, descendants of Spanish conquerors and noble native women, but also signaled the construction of a specific type of mestizaje, one that recognized the purity of blood or potential purity of blood of the native population, and thus allowed for the complete fusion of Indian blood, of Indian lineages into old Christian Spanish ones. Indeed, in the last decades of the 16th century, royal policies began to privilege castizos over other castas, among other things, by making them eligible for the priesthood and making them exempt from paying tribute. And the Holy Office started to consider them eligible for the status of purity of blood. In 1590, for example, was a different matter altogether. The early history of the first Mexican caste categories reveals, then, several important aspects of the Sistema de Castas. First and most obvious, the system of classification that's represented in the Casta Paintings was not simply a product of the Enlightenment's taxonomic impulse, as Ilona already emphasized, or even of the late colonial Creole imagination. Although it might have only been in the 18th century that the casta categorizations were conceived as a system and made visual, and in that regard, the scientific spirit of the times probably did have an influence, Spaniards had begun to deploy some of the classifications and to place them in hierarchies in the late 1500s. It was also then that they started to articulate some of the Sistema's main ordering principles, including the notion that reproduction between different castas produced new castas, that black blood was more damaging to Spanish lineages than native blood, and that the descendants of Spanish-Indian unions could, if they continued to reproduce with Spaniards, claim limpieza de sangre. Second, when the metropolitan discourse of limpieza de sangre started to be extended to colonial categories, it was initially framed, as in Spain, in religious and generational terms. Thus, when in his Historia Eclesiástica Indiana, finished in 1604, the Franciscan Jerónimo de Mendieta first explicitly addressed the question of the Indians' eligibility for institutions that had purity requirements, he argued that, like conversos, they were new Christians who should be excluded for several generations until their commitment to the faith was certain. This temporal argument, which implied that at some point the native population would be eligible for Old Christian status, especially if they mixed with Spaniards, could have been applied to blacks as well, because they too were relatively recent converts, at least those that were imported, who were imported directly from Africa. However, as stated earlier, this possibility was quickly undermined by their association with slavery and subsequent systematic inclusion in the category of impurity, and more generally by the different legal and theological statuses vis-a-vis the native people that they and their descendants occupied within the Spanish colonial order. And third, the early history of the casta classifications in central Mexico indicates how rapidly the discourse of limpieza de sangre and its genealogical practices and procedures were adapted to the colonial situation. The Inquisition, which since the 1560s had established guidelines to verify the purity of blood of its officials and familiars, exemplified and led this discursive adaptation. As the 1590 case of Juan de Reina demonstrates, which I alluded to earlier, when the Mexican Holy Office was formally established and began to conduct investigations to certify Old Christian ancestry, its commissioners resorted to genealogical formulas for granting or denying the status of limpieza de sangre to people of mixed ancestry. These formulas were necessary because, as the Holy Office's references to castizo also implied, ongoing reproduction between Spaniards and castas had quickly, very quickly turned skin color and phenotype in general into an unreliable, a powerful but unreliable index of descent. Despite a greater systematization and production of caste categories in central Mexico, the sistema de castas became increasingly unstable in the second half of the 17th century, which New Spain witnessed not only a dramatic surge in the population of mixed ancestry, but a rise in social mobility due to the expansion of mercantile capitalism, and an increase in marriages between Spaniards and the castas. And as Patricia Seed has argued for central Mexico, for the first time, Spanish women start to marry non-Spanish men, which might explain why there is this very intense preoccupation with purity in the 18th century. Within this context of rapid socioeconomic change, Spanish notions of purity of blood and race underwent some changes, and I'm just going to be very brief about this, even though it's a very complicated subject. At least as reflected in the declarations of people who testified in purity investigations, they became more of a discourse. Notions of purity became much more of a discourse about the body, and particularly about skin color, than they had been in the past. Thus, when in the early 18th century, the authorities of a Franciscan convent in Querétaro interrogated community elders regarding the ancestry of two brothers, Fray Nicolás de Velasco and Fray Miguel de Velasco, who were suspected of having, quote, the bad race of mulattoes, many reported that they knew or suspected that the brothers were not pure because of the skin color and hair texture of their mother and some of their grandparents. The linkage between the concept of limpieza and human pigmentation, which occurred as theories seeking to account for the skin color of native people and blacks were proliferating in the Atlantic world, gradually secularized some of the principles of the discourse of purity of blood. As the casta painting suggests, by the 18th century, the notion that it took 3 or 4 generations for new Christians to become old Christians and for the descendants of a Spanish Indian union to claim limpieza had given way to similar genealogical notions about whitening. But again, the possibility of complete redemption, of complete transformation, of complete whitening through progressive infusions of Spanish blood was not allowed for the descendants of blacks, at least not in New Spain. 18th century discourses of difference and the increasing emphasis on biology and skin color were thus grafted onto older ones, as the notion of race transmuted yet again in the context of the Enlightenment, as it became increasingly, though not entirely secularized, its older meanings strongly informed its new ones. So 18th century Mexican Creole ideas regarding mestizaje clearly did not constitute a benign racial ideology, but they were faithful to the particular historical and cultural genealogy of the Spanish concept of raza and how it had been reformulated in New Spain. Thank you.